Hello, thank you for coming to the True Crime Podcast today. We've got Neil Jackson, who is a filmmaker and documentary producer, and we're going to be talking about the Sibbet case. Before we get into the Sibbet case then, Neil, would you like to just tell us a bit about yourself and what led to the Sibbet case?
So I'm originally from rural Essex, moved up to northeast of England, County Durham, in about the year 2000. The Sibbet case up there is kind of a bit of an urban legend, really. Not least because of its link to the Get Carter film, which is
I watched that with my dad.
Film.
Yeah, when I was young.
Yeah, it's still one of my favourite films.
Yeah.
However, I will say there are only tenuous links with the case. There aren't really. It's not really a copycat film or anything like that.
Stallone did a version of it, or didn't he? That wasn't as good.
He tried, yeah. Yeah. No one will beat Michael Caine in that role. Michael Caine in that role is fantastic.
Oh, I forgot to say in the introduction that you're a fellow Masonic brother of Steve Rafe as well, aren't you?
I am.
Do you have a ring?
No, I don't know. No rings. No. I'm lower down the ladder, you see.
And Steve's just been here and done an almost 5-hour podcast. Are you going to break that record, Neil?
I doubt it. We'll soon see. There's only one way to find out.
Oh, sorry for interrupting. Sibbet case.
Yeah, so it was kind of a bit of an urban legend, really. Like I say, up in the northeast, it's one of those cases that, because of its link to Get Carter, it's still on people's lips. 55 years, later.
So is it an unsolved?
It's not unsolved. No, it's two men were found guilty of the murder.
Of the murder of who?
Of a man called Angus Sibbet, who was a cash collector for a company called Social Club Services, who ran basically all the gaming machines in the area.
Right.
And back in 1966, 67, this was massive business, and the northeast was full of it. People sometimes think that Newcastle, and I obviously wasn't there at that time, but people think that Newcastle was all kind of flat caps and whippets. But I can assure you it wasn't at that time. It absolutely wasn't. The nightclubs had exploded. The acts that were coming into London, the big acts that were playing in London were doing a night at the Astor, but they were doing a week in Newcastle. So it really was up and coming.
So the cash is flowing. Was Sibbet then transporting cash? Was that a motive?
Well, part of Sibbet's job was going to the working men's clubs, which were unique really to the north of England at that time, where a lot of the machines were. And his job was to go and empty the machines, collect the money, pay the stewards, because obviously they all got something for having the machine in the club, and obviously take the money back and get it banked. So yeah, I mean, it would be easy to say that might be a motive, but he had money on him when he was found. So
could you take us through the day of the crime slowly?
Yeah. For anybody who isn't aware of it, it happened overnight on early January in 1967, and his body was found at 5:15 in the morning in a very small mining town called South Hetton, which is kind of Sunderland, Durham, round that way. It was found in the back of his own car, which was a Mark 10 Jaguar, so quite a posh car, in quite a industrial town, because South Hetton, although it was a very small mining village, South Hetton had a 24-hour coal production going on. The seam there produced some really, really good quality coal that was used in all the power stations in the north. So it operated 24 hours a day, and that might not seem relevant now, but it will do later on. So he was found at 5:15 in the morning. Police soon kind of worked out who he was. A guy called Chief Superintendent Kell took charge of the investigation from Durham Police. He arrived about 6:30 in the morning. A police photographer arrived. He took 3 photographs. One of the front of the vehicle, one of the rear of the vehicle, and one of the body in situ. They were the only photographs he took at the scene. And then Superintendent Kell decided that because he was very forensically aware, he'd recently done this new forensics course. Forensics was quite kind of in its infancy there. He decided he wanted to create a mobile crime scene. So instead of taking the temperature of the body and working out the time of death in that way, what he decided to do was to transport everything as a mobile crime scene, as he called it, back to the police station. So I said Angus Sibbet was found at 5:15. They took them several hours to find a truck that would tow this vehicle. It was a big car. It was heavy, and I've been told by a few people that there was a safe in the back. So it was big. It was a big, heavy car. It took them a long time to find something big enough to actually take it. They then carried it on a low loader. Now, when the vehicle was found, it had the driver's window wound down. The rear driver's window had been shot out. So this car was put onto a low loader. It was transported to the police station at Peterlee. It took them hours to get it there at snail's pace. And it wasn't until about 12:30 at lunchtime when it arrived there. He was then taken out of the car, placed on a tarpaulin on the ground. A few more photographs were taken of him. And it wasn't then until 1 o'clock when he entered the mortuary when his temperature was taken. So
this is a bad decision then to move all of the evidence and cause contamination. Is this going to cause all kinds of legal problems later on?
I think it's a massive problem because any true crime enthusiast knows that the temperature is what determines the time of death, and the time of death would be crucial in this case going forward because the two men that were eventually convicted had an alibi for pretty much all of that night, apart from a half an hour period where they were travelling. That they both were together the entire night, and there's never been any dispute from either man about that. But that half an hour time frame was really the only time that the police could find that was when the murder had happened.
Are these guys still in prison?
No, both men were released after a 12-year sentence. So they took a 12-year sentence. They were found guilty, both of them.
And they served their sentences.
They served their whole
massive case of injustice.
Yeah.
Then
for me it is, yeah. But I think just to take it back a stage, you asked how I got involved. I mean, initially, I was with my good friend actually, Steve Wraith, who has just broken the record for the longest podcast. I was with him one day and we were doing a documentary project, and we went to see an old face down south in the country, and he got talking. He said, "Oh, you're up in that neck of the woods, aren't you? What do you think? What do you know about this case?" And I kind of, I knew about it, but I didn't know all the detail. He said, "Oh, I've got this book. I'll lend it to you." And so what it was Most Unnatural by Peter Human and David Lewis. It's out of print now. It's a Penguin classic, and it did big numbers back in the day, but it's worth quite a lot of money now. But anyway, he lent it to me. I took it home, and I read it cover to cover that night, and I couldn't put it down. It was literally one of those moments where I couldn't go to bed, couldn't go to sleep until I'd finished the book. It's probably one of the only books that I've ever, that's ever captured my imagination like that. But what captured my imagination was that it just didn't feel right. It just didn't feel right. And the two men, so one of them was Michael Lavaglio, who I will talk about in quite a lot of detail, I think, and one of them was Dennis Stafford. And Dennis, I'd met a couple of times with Steve, and so I kind of knew Dennis a little bit. And I'd not met Michael, and Michael didn't do any interviews. He doesn't do, he's done probably, at that point, he'd done a couple of TV things, but, over the space of about 20 years, he'd done very little. He was a very private person, very difficult to kind of get to. So I got to the end of this book, and I felt I already had a bit of knowledge about Dennis, but I still didn't feel that it added up. And inexplicably, I decided I decided I wanted to find out a bit more about it. Really, it's one of them kind of inquiring mind. I'm a filmmaker. I love documentary stuff. It's how my mind works. I want to find out more, and so I tried to get to Michael to see if I could speak to him. Because it just, like I say, it just left me feeling uneasy. There were so many parts of the case, and this book, for anybody who can get their hands on it, this book really, it's quite dry. It's legal, and Peter Heumann and David Lewis. Peter Heumann was actually the solicitor for them in one of their appeal hearings. So they look at it really from a legal point of view, but they take each part of the case and take out the bits that just don't quite add up, and every chapter almost there's something where you're kind of left going, what?
That's
how
what
did that happen?
That's what I felt when I was watching Making a Murderer.
Yeah.
And this is all wrong. How is this possible? How is it even going this far? It's just got this momentum where they have to be convicted at all costs.
Yeah, and there's probably a reason for that. I'll tell you that later on. We'll probably come to that. But Dennis and Michael were two very different people. And, Dennis, by his own admission, was a career criminal at that time. He came from a good family. He didn't necessarily need to go into crime, but he did for whatever reason. He'd escaped from 2 prisons. He'd escaped from Dartmoor. He'd escaped from Wandsworth.
How had he escaped?
Well, it's not. I'll be honest. This isn't really my story to tell. It's Dennis, really. But I mean, my knowledge of it is that that he made keys, basically.
They made keys.
Yeah, they made keys, and it was very clever. It was an ingenious way to do it.
Yeah.
And he was on the run for a bit, and so he had a quite a long record, Dennis. Whereas in contrast, Michael had no record. He was come from a really strict Catholic family. He went to Sunday school. He sang in the choir. He played the organ. He was the least likely person to have been involved in something like that. So they were two and that intrigued me as well. That they were two opposite characters. So how they kind of ended up in that situation, and it was really it was fate, I guess, and it was down to Vince Lander, who was Michael's brother. Now, Vince was a businessman, and all of them originated down south in London, and they'd come up to the northeast. They'd moved their business up to the northeast in about 1959, 58, 59. But the reason that they'd moved it up to the northeast became clear only fairly recently. So Vince ran all things coin operated, basically, in London. So as things were starting to come in from the States, from Vegas, places like that, so it was one-armed bandits, it was jukeboxes, it was pinball machines, it was all of those kind of stuff. And before that, he'd made his fortune. He got the franchise to, you remember, well, you won't remember, I don't remember, but when television used to be able to get BBC. And then,
BBC, ITV.
Yeah. Well,
and then BBC One, BBC Two, ITV, that was it.
That's right, yeah.
And then came Channel 4.
Yeah, you and I were old enough to remember when Channel 4 came on, yeah. But before that, there was just the BBC. And so when ITV came online, Vince got the franchise for the whole country.
Wow.
For the little box thing that the gadget that enabled you could put into your existing telly that would enable you to be able to pick up ITV. Yeah. So he made a decent amount of money. He made quite a lot of money out of that. And so that enabled him to then set himself up doing this. Now, while he was doing that, Michael was off doing his national service. So they didn't, Michael was the younger brother, so they didn't work together at that point. It was only when Michael came back from the national service that he went into business with his brother. And they were very successful. They had a lot of machines and a lot of clubs around London and the southeast. They had their own coffee bars. They were, they really had explored that whole explosion of culture and coffee shops and pinball machines and people's dancing in coffee shops and stuff like that. It was a brilliant time for them, and they made a lot of money. Unbeknown to Michael at that time, Vince was also doing a little bit of consultancy work with the Krays. And apparently he upset them by trying to put some of his machines into the same places. Now, whether this is a jump too far or not, I'll let you decide. But one day, shortly after that, Michael got a knock at the door. He answers the door, and there's two men outside with a briefcase, and he just thought they were insurance salesmen, something like that. Michael was very naive, very, trusting, and they basically said, you're going to buy our insurance policy. We're from the Krays, so you're going to need to pay us this money. And they kind of basically threatened him, and they cut his tie. And he always says that, he remembers the tie thing, and if you don't pay, we'll come back and cut something else. And so that was the catalyst for them moving. Many years later, I did speak to somebody who claimed to have been at a meeting with Reg and Vince, where Reg delivered one of his trademark cigarette punches to Vince and put him on the floor. So there was definitely some bad blood there. And almost overnight, they picked their entire business, loaded it into vans, and took it up to the northeast. And then the reason the northeast was the place to go was that Vince had been up there fairly recently with a man called Angus Sibbet to visit Angus's dad, who was a Gateshead resident who'd recently been taken ill. And while Vince was up there, they were friends with Angus. Angus needed somebody to take him back home so he could see his dad in hospital. While he was there, Vince noticed all these social clubs, which was a new thing. Working men's clubs, it is quite a northern thing. And there's less of them there now, but they still are there, and they're still quite a blast from the past, really, still. But Vince noticed all of these clubs and thought, hang on a minute, there's money to be made here. There's no machines in any of these places. They have an act on a Saturday night, they do a bit of bingo, and that's it. So when the time came to move, the northeast was the place to go. So everything got moved up to the northeast. And at that time, Dennis was nowhere near. Dennis was in a completely different place. He was in London, but he had nothing to do with the company. And it wasn't until a few years later, it wasn't until about 1966, when Michael had opened his own nightclub in Newcastle, and they needed a manager, that Dennis appeared on the scene. So Dennis appeared on the scene in July '66. So that was when Michael and Dennis first met. And as I said, they were two very, very different characters, but they soon became friends.
So there was a friendship with the victim.
There was, yeah. More so between Michael and Angus. Michael and Angus were best friends. Michael was Angus's best man at his wedding. They were best friends.
How did that friendship start?
Well, there's a story for you. Michael always tells the story of when Michael joined the business, they were still working at, they still were doing some of these TV conversions. So he went to a Chinese restaurant in London, in South London, and Angus Sibbet and his brother were running this restaurant, Jim. And Michael's first experience of Angus was the man tasked to hold Michael's legs while he dangled out of the window to try and move the area around to kind of go, that's Michael's first recollection of Angus.
So because of these relationships then, is that why the cops brought them in as suspects originally?
No. The reason they were brought in was, I said he was found in a Mark 10 Jaguar.
Yeah.
The Mark 10 Jaguar was damaged. It had been involved in an accident.
Okay.
So there was some damage to the front of the vehicle. An anonymous tip-off told the police that there was a red E-Type Jaguar in a garage in Sunderland being repaired. And that E-Type Jaguar belonged to Vince Lander. And Vince Lander was conveniently out of the country at that time, but had lent it to Dennis Stafford.
Right.
Now, neither of the two men denied being in the E-Type Jaguar. Neither of the two men denied actually arranging to meet Angus. But Michael and Dennis's version of events differs greatly from the police. So Michael and Dennis say that they were due to meet Angus Sibbet in a club in Newcastle to discuss some business. It was only Michael who was supposed to meet him, but Michael had gone to see Dennis that evening, and Dennis had gone, I'll come with you. And they were going to discuss some business because they'd all been away over Christmas and New Year, and Angus had been left with the reins. So Angus had got some information about a few clubs that wanted things doing because, I said earlier about it was pinball machines, it was things that you put coins in. But what Michael brought to that business was Michael brought almost a forensic mind to a mathematical mind to it, because he kind of thought, well, if social clubs they need acts, they need carpet, they need roof tiles, they need, so Michael kind of created this whole business where if a social club needed anything, they could get it from Michael's company. That could be the gaming machines, but it could be anything. So there was this big refit of a club going on that Angus was going to talk to Michael about. So they arranged to meet in the Birdcage Club in Newcastle in Stowell Street. The club's still there, although it's not called that anymore. And they arranged to meet there at... I have to get the times right because the time is crucial in this. But they'd arranged to meet, I believe, at midnight. And so Michael had gone to Dennis's house. They decided to go together to meet at the Birdcage. Dennis and Michael get in the E-Type. They drive, first of all, to Michael's house in Newcastle because they're expecting a phone call from Vince. So they get there just before midnight. 3 people see the car there. One of them even sees Michael through the window and waves to him. They then get back into the car, go the short distance to where the club was. They go into the club. They're seen at 12:25, something like that, by the act who had just come off the stage. So literally walked into them as they were coming in. They were clean. There was no sign of any dirt on the clothes. They weren't out of breath. They were just their normal, happy selves. And they went in. They sat down, and Angus sadly didn't arrive. What transpired was that Angus had left another club in Newcastle at 11:15, and that was the last time he was seen alive.
So what is the police version?
The police version is that Michael and Dennis agreed to meet Angus somewhere around the Southampton area. There was a convoy of the 2 vehicles that kind of carried on for quite a while. And again, there's some sightings of 2 Jaguars quite close together that were given. And then the cars collide. So the E-Type pulls around, goes in front, and then stops, and the Mark 10 goes into the back of it, causing damage to both vehicles. At that point, Angus is shot. He's bundled into the back of his own car. That car, to get him in he was a big bloke. That's the other thing. Michael and Dennis are not. Neither of them were big. They're both quite small. But he was put in his own car. It was snow. It was muddy. It was really really bad conditions. He was then. One of them took the E-Type. One of them took the Mark 10. They drove up to the next junction, which was Pestpool Lane, into Pestpool Lane, which is like a tiny B road that kind of goes on right angles like that. And they stop halfway down to get rid of the evidence. This is the police's version of events. And it's important that they stop there because it means that crucial half hour that I mentioned earlier on works for them. So they stop there, clear out the evidence from the car, but leave the biggest bit of evidence in the car, which is Angus Sibbet, dead in the back. Drive him round this series of right angle bends in the ice and the snow, and then almost arrive back at the point of the murder where the car breaks down as a result of the collision, and then the 2 men scarper to Newcastle. That was the police's version of events.
With what motive?
Well, this is the key thing. There never was a motive presented at trial. Now, there've been a number of motives put forward since. The biggest one being that Angus was stealing money, and I have no doubt that Angus probably was stealing money. However, what most people don't know is that he was a director of social club services. He wasn't just an employee, he wasn't just the cash collector. So if he was stealing money, he was stealing it from himself. I don't think that was the motive. I genuinely don't think that was the motive. But no motive was presented at trial. There were no witnesses to the murder presented at trial. There was no weapon found, still hasn't been found. The whole case came to court within 3 months of the offence happening, which is unheard of today. And they were tried in their hometown in Newcastle, which again would be unheard of now. But the evidence presented at court was so flimsy that it would not have even made it to the magistrate's court today.
And you said they had an alibi.
Yeah, well, the alibi they had was that, at 11:30 they left Dennis's house, and at Dennis's house there were their partners, but also a housekeeper who had no, affiliation, no reason to lie. 11:30 they left there. The next time they were spotted was around midnight at Chelsea Grove at Michael's house in Newcastle, and the vehicle was spotted twice. Michael was spotted once in the window. So and at that point, it turned out that kind of midnight time was where Angus should have been being shot in South Hetton. But Michael and Dennis were in Chelsea Grove. They'd got witnesses to say that. And then within another 10, 15 minutes, they were in a club in Newcastle. And it would have been impossible for them to have got from, South Hetton at midnight to, this club, even in those days.
So how flawed was the police investigation to, produce this questionable evidence?
I think there are a number of bits of questionable evidence, and I think the police, the police would say that it was a different time then. Policing methods were different. I don't think there's really any excuse for some of these mistakes that have been made. First of all, the time of death that I've already talked to you about. So, he didn't have his temperature measured until 1:15. But they could be precise to within 10 minutes of when he was when he was killed. But they hadn't taken his temperature until 1:15. That, for me, to start with, is unfathomable. There were a number of things withheld from the defence at the time of trial, so they didn't know these things existed. And again, times have changed, methods have changed, the laws around disclosure have changed. So Michael and Dennis weren't aware that there were fingerprints taken. In fact, the police denied that there'd been any fingerprints taken. And as recently as 2006, Chief Superintendent Kell was still swearing under oath that there were no fingerprints found. However, we've got the police notebooks and we've got the statements of the fingerprint officers. So both officers, one was Midgley, one was called Sams. And in those books, they detail very clearly that there were fingerprints found, that they were of good quality, and that they didn't match either of the accused or the deceased. So who did they belong to?
What's that called? Exculpatory evidence.
Yeah, and we never got to the bottom of that because again, through the passage of time, they don't exist anymore. Now, after the trial, I'll come back to some of the evidence in a second, but it's important to know that after the trial, it was only a year after the trial, so before they'd made their first appeal, Chief Superintendent Kell, there's a note in the police file that says that he's basically returned all the evidence and transferred it here and got rid of some of it, and he emptied the file of all of this evidence within a matter of months. And it's okay to say, well, it was different then, but where did those fingerprints go? We can't find them.
And there was 2 photographs taken at the scene.
Yeah, I mentioned that at the beginning. Nowadays, when there's a murder and the police photographer gets there, he'll take hundreds of photographs, and this guy only took 3. That, for me, to start with, is odd. But if you look at the two photographs of the vehicles in particular, there's a couple of things that stand out. 2 or 3 things. Firstly, they're taken at different times. Okay, one of them, it's a lovely, bright, starry night. There is snow on the ground, but the clouds are clear. The street lights you can see. Everything is as it should be. The second one, it's snow coming down, the sky's grey, can't see the stars, the light is different. They just don't add up. Don't add up at all. I think the other thing with those photographs, and it wasn't until I worked with a chap called Ian Wright, who's an American photographer, who's an English photographer actually, quite a famous English photographer, photographed the Beatles and the Stones and all of those back in the 60s. He lives in America now. And he examined the photographs with me, and that particular photograph of the car, he highlighted that the headlights were on. Now, the significance of that is that the car was damaged. The first policeman on the scene said that the lights were glowing, the side lights were glowing very dimly, but that the battery had run down as a result of it being there from midnight till 5:15 with the blowers on, basically. Because the first miners who found it turned the ignition off. So it'd been blowing cold air on this dead body from midnight, if you believe the police's timings. If those headlights were on when the police photographs were taken, there's something not right there. Now, I don't know what that is. I genuinely don't. I can't explain it. But those headlights are on. So we took it one stage further and we went to a Jaguar expert, somebody who's got Mark 10 Jaguars, somebody who's worked on them for 30, 40 years, somebody who owns two himself. And he looked at the photograph and he said, no, absolutely, 100%, those headlights are on. How could they have been on if the car battery had run down? So, as I say, I can't explain it, but it's there for anybody to see.
So I got so disturbed by Making a Murderer that I wrote a book called Unmaking a Murderer.
Oh, did you?
Yeah, and the chapters, it's 10 chapters, it's the 10 methods the authorities, prosecutors, detectives use to frame innocent people. And two of them have come up here in what we're about to discuss now.
I mean, look, what I will say before you ask that question, what I will say is that I never went into this to kind of try and get them off or try and prove that wasn't my intention. I'll be brutally honest. My intention to begin with was I want to make a documentary about this. But it wasn't until eventually I got to speak to Michael and we kind of became friends, really, that I suddenly felt I wanted to kind of go down the legal route, really, and the documentary took a back seat, and we went down the legal route and challenged a lot of this stuff. But go on, I've interrupted you.
Yeah,
Sorry.
so two of the methods that the corrupt authorities employ to frame innocent people is one is to procure false witnesses, and the reverse of that is to either hide or disqualify or make not credible honest witnesses. So in this case, dozens of witness statements were withheld from the defence, which is exculpatory evidence again, and many of those were from minors.
Yeah.
So what do you say about the witnesses then?
Well, there are tons of them. Remember, I said at the beginning it was a 24-hour town, so the coal was being mined all the time. So there were people coming and going. It was a busy village at all times of the day. And so there were, I think it was about 45, something like that, miners walked past that Mark 10 from about midnight time and gave statements to say that they'd seen it. Not one of them said that the car was damaged. Not one of them saw a body in the back. As far as they were concerned, and remember, Mark 10 Jaguar in a small mining village attracts attention. And so there were lots of people who said, well, we put our hands on the bonnet, we had a look inside, we did, it's odd seeing a car like that, They were adamant there was no damage to the vehicle and adamant that there was no body in the back.
What were the statements from James Golden?
James Golden is a very interesting case because James Golden was a miner, and he'd finished his shift and he was cycling along on his way home. Now, when he gave his first statement, it was before the police had determined where the murder site was. And unbeknown to everybody at the time, he placed his position to be exactly where the murder was, when it was happening, at exactly that time. He was supposed to have been cycling past. So
people love to insert themselves into cases, don't they?
Well, they do, but the thing was, he didn't see anything. Yeah. So they went to the pit. They interviewed everybody at the pit, and James Golden goes, yeah. I was cycling home, and he gives this statement, and he says, no, I cycled down that road. I was there at this time. I didn't see anything. No, I was overtaken by 2 cars. I think they might have been Jaguars, but no, definitely no. They didn't stop. There was no. So anyway, he gives this very short statement. Basically, it says, I was cycling along here. 2 cars passed me when I was at this position, and then they decide where the murder scene must have been. So they go back to James Golden, and they ask James Golden to make another statement. Different officer, a more senior officer, goes and visits him, and he makes a second statement. In this second statement, he makes no mention of the first one, and he's in a different position. Then he's visited again. In fact, he's visited, but then he's told he needs to go to the main incident headquarters, the main police station. So he's then taken to a police station where he's told he needs to make a third statement. Again, that third statement makes no mention of the previous statements, and again he's in a slightly different position. But the defence were only told about that last statement, and the jury were only aware of that last statement. So the jury and the judge and the defence all presumed that was the only statement he'd made, but he hadn't, and his evidence alone would have rocked the boat. An interesting thing you said just now about the ways to discredit witnesses and things like that. The summing up that the judge did at the end of the case was so bad that it is now taught in in law school as an example of what not to do.
It's the same with Brendan Dassey, the interrogation, the fact feeding. They now use that in schools to show them what not to do. Yeah.
That every single witness, without fail, who supported their case, including those 3 people who saw the car when it was at Michael's house, and the one who waved at him through the window, the judge systematically took every single one of them down. Were they lying? Were they mistaken? Could they have meant this? Of course, they're trying to be truthful, but memory plays a funny. There was every single instance, and even the words that he used in describing Michael and Dennis, that they were unsavoury, that they had lifestyles that were, that most people would find, abhorrent. They didn't. They described Michael's girlfriend as his mistress. Mike, he didn't have a mistress, but it was the way that they were painted in court by that judge in the end, and that the last things the jury heard before they went and made their deliberations had a massive impact on the case.
Yeah, I don't know if it was the last chapter or the other penultimate chapter on Making a Murder is about the jury tampering.
That's right.
Yeah. Okay, so the Ccrc investigation in 2013, what did that reveal?
Well, I said to you that I'd gone into this to do a documentary, and that was kind of my main focus right at the beginning. But I eventually got to Michael, and right at the beginning I was talking about Michael being quite a private person, and it took me quite a lot of months to get to Michael and to get to speak to him, and I had to jump through a few hoops. I got vetted a couple of times by different people, supporters of his, who just wanted to make sure I wasn't some kind of fly-by-night journalist who wanted to make a quick few quid out of him. And eventually I clearly passed the test, and he rang me one night, and we spoke for, it must have been an hour and a half, 2 hours, something like that. And I asked him on that call, I said to him, "Did you do it, Michael?" And he said, "No, I absolutely 100% did not do it." But he said, if the murder happened then, Dennis didn't do it either, because we were together all night. So I kind of thought, I really feel sorry for this bloke, I learned a lot about him. I learned a lot about his story and what he'd done when he left prison, and how he'd set up a charity, and he'd helped disabled kids, and he'd done so much good stuff, and it was just so out of character for him. And I felt like I ought to kind of almost ask his permission to kind of do this documentary. But then I just from the inconsistencies that we've talked about, and from the conversation I had with Michael, I just felt like there was still a stone to be unturned. There was still, we hadn't exhausted the legal side of things. Now there's a rule with the CCRC, the Criminal Cases Review Commission. They're kind of the gatekeeper to the appeal court, for anybody that doesn't know. So if you want to get your case heard at the Court of Appeal, you have to first present your case to the Criminal Cases Review Commission, who are made up of ex-police, ex-judiciary. It's a tough call. But the rule is that you can only present fresh evidence. So evidence that has not been before a court or been before the Criminal Cases Review Commission before. Now that's a really tough ask when you've got a crime that was committed 50 years ago. When, as I've already described, there's a huge amount of the evidence that just does not exist anymore. But we'd had this little breakthrough with Ian Wright and the photographer and the headlights, and I thought that was a good little thing, And we found a guy who he claimed he'd seen the murderer. He claimed he'd met him that morning.
Whoa!
So we did a bit of digging. In a previous Criminal Cases Review Commission application, this guy had been mentioned, a guy called Tom Fellows, and he'd been mentioned, he had got about 3 lines in the report, that was it. He'd apparently given a statement, and the CCRC had looked at this statement and come to this, decided that he had a business arrangement with Vince Lander, and so he wasn't to be trusted. But some of the things he said in his statement, I thought, it's a bit odd. So, and we only had 3 or 4 lines quoted, we didn't have the full statement. So I ended up in... a few months later in the National Records Office in Kew, poring over all of the files that are kept there. Because what I will say is that Durham Police have been very reluctant to help in any way. When I started this, I went to the then Police and Crime Commissioner, who'd literally just been appointed, a guy called Ron Hogg, who, God rest his soul, he died a couple of years ago now, or a year ago, I think. And to start with, he was very, very keen to help. I think I was the second person he came and visited after he'd been appointed. He saw the evidence I showed him. He really wanted to be a part of it and to right a wrong if it had occurred. And he said some stuff, I filmed him actually, and he said some stuff there, that I was really disturbed about some of the evidence that he showed me, all of this stuff. He said, look, what we want is we want to see the file. We want access to the file. I'll show you my evidence. You show me what you've got. And let's together try and work to right this wrong. These guys are in their 80s. They deserve to have some closure before it's too late. And he agreed he would try and get us that far. But he said, look, what I've got to do first, I've got to appoint my chief constable. As soon as I've done that, we'll work on doing that. Well, he appointed a guy called Mike Barton, who's recently left the post now. But Mike made it very clear that Ron Hogg was to step away and that they weren't going to have anything to do with it and leave the CCRC to do what they need to do. So in doing that, they sealed the file. So I had no access to that file at all because Mike Barton, I've got the email, it was his personal decision to seal the file before the Criminal Cases Review Commission application had gone in. So we had no access to that. So I was left pouring through what was left at the National Archives. So there I am in Kew, and I find Tom Fellows' full statement. We've only seen the 4 lines of it, so it's a bit of a revelation in itself. But here he is; he's describing, this gunman turned up at his place of work in the morning, about 8 o'clock in the morning. He was injured; he'd got an injured left knee. Tom Fellows rented this unit from a couple of characters called the Dunn brothers, who had some link to Vince Lander, tenuous link. So he was renting this unit. It had nothing to do with the Dunns. He was just renting the unit. It was a paint sprayer. So he's there in the morning, about 8 o'clock. This guy turns up. He's injured. Can I see Colin Dunn? I need to see Colin Dunn. I've been told to come here. And Tom says, well, what on earth's wrong? And the guy kind of fires this gun into the pipework on the side of the wall, and he goes, I was told to come here if it went wrong, and I've just shot the man and he's done this, and he's thinking Tom was in on it, and Tom had no idea, and so Tom kept quiet about this because he felt in fear of his life. He'd got kids, he'd got a young family, and it wasn't until about 1980 something when he'd gone to the police and he'd made this statement, and the police laughed him out of the police station. No further action, nothing. We've got our men; they're in prison already, so let's just leave it. And Tom didn't think anything of it anymore, but I found out where he lived. I wasn't going to let it. I wasn't going to let it.
You
lie.
found out where the man lived?
Oh yeah. So I went and saw Tom, and what we did with Tom is Tom was great. Tom allowed us to involve a former Metropolitan Police artist, so somebody who he actually trained the FBI in the techniques that he uses, which is to evoke past memories that people have forgotten of historic crimes, victims of really traumatic crimes that their brains shut down, and it's his job to kind of try and get those facts back out of them, and he uses these techniques to create almost a photo fit almost. So we did this, and we got this photo fit, and Tom, bless him, allowed us to do it, and so we submitted that to the CCRC. We got a 3D modeler to look at the collision between the two vehicles, because realistically that was the only thing that convicted them, the cars. If the cars hadn't have touched, then there would have been no case. That was the only evidence that convicted them. And again, Michael and Dennis, what I haven't told you is while they were waiting for Angus, the car was damaged outside the Birdcage Club, is their version of events. So they don't deny that there was an accident, but where that accident happened is a cause of discussion. So we got that. We got the 3D modeler who from scratch created this crash simulation, and he found that the angles and the bits, and there was damage there that couldn't have been caused by those two cars colliding. There was some that did work, but we did know also that the paint that was used to convict them, the paint was a red Jaguar paint was found on the but Jaguar also used exactly the same kind of paint for minis. So there was a lot of stuff that didn't come out, but the 3D model thing went into the CCRC as fresh evidence. And we got to a point where the CCRC came back to us within probably about. Michael was very poorly, and we had to. We wrote to them and said, "Look, Michael's ill. We need you to expedite this, make it quick. Get it going quicker." And they were reasonably good at doing that. And within about a year, they wrote back to us and said, "We've looked at all your evidence. We've looked at everything. We'd used." In order to prove our theory about the headlights, for instance, we'd used the Jaguar expert. We'd used 3 different photographic experts, world-renowned photographic experts. One from America, 2 from America. Sorry, one of them had been an FBI scenes of crime photographer. Another one who'd been in photography and proper negatives and all that kind of proper photography for 50 odd years. We'd got the best people to look at this. We'd got our 3D modeler, who wasn't just a student who was writing code. This guy was involved in recreating the Dunblane scene, for the court case and things like that. He had a real track record of doing stuff, legal stuff. So he came highly recommended, and the CCRC did not use a single expert to challenge anything we put forward. They basically went, no. And so we went back and said, well, hang on, how can you come to this decision that you're not going to continue without telling us what you've done? And they came back and said, well, we used a magnifying glass. We'd used a lab in America that blew up these photographs to the size of a billboard that, looked at it under, massive, great photographic lab. They'd used a magnifying glass, it was laughable, really. And so we appealed. And at that point, I got in touch with Michael's initial solicitor, which was Sir David Napley. Now Sir David's no longer with us, but Napley still exists. It's a big criminal law firm in the city of London. And they said to Michael, when Michael was found guilty, look, we still think you're innocent. If anything ever comes up, we'll represent you for free. And so I went to them and called in that favour and said, look, we're going back to the CCRC as an appeal. it may not, it depends on them whether it's going to go to the Court of Appeal or not. Can you look at what we've put forward and see? So I went to them, and they invited me down to their offices in London, and they pulled together all the boxes of material they had of the case. So I've now got all the stuff from the National Archives, the bits and bobs Michael's been able to give me, all of the stuff that Kingsley Napoli have got, and in there we found more statements, more things that we hadn't seen. So there were statements that had been given that suggested another motive. There were statements in there and copies of police notebooks that we hadn't seen that show that Vince Lander was interviewed, but there's no record of that interview. There's no statement. There's nothing, and the police say, well, no, he wasn't. But there's a police notebook that says he was there, and he was there 3 times, and once he was allowed to inspect the vehicle in the police yard. So what was going on there?
Wasn't helpful to the case, so it disappeared.
Exactly. So, and again, the police will say it was a different time, but these 2 men have served a 12-year sentence, had their lives taken away from them. That doesn't wash. It doesn't wash. And we were very lucky. We got a brilliant QC who said, I'll look at it for nothing. And he did. And he was from Michael Mansfield's chambers, so he came recommended. And he had a good look at it, and he said, right, this is what we need. So he narrowed down our things to Tom Fellows, to the photograph of the headlights, and to this motive, and the 3D stuff, so we put a very strong case back to the CCRC, who then went, well, we'll go and get some experts. So off they went. They got their experts. So then you're in a situation, right? Then you're in a situation where you've got
experts battling experts.
Yeah. So which one do you believe? Do you go best of 3? Do you do? It's impossible, isn't it? So they get to pick their experts. They get to show them our evidence first. So it's an unfair situation.
Experts will say anything as well. In America now, it's called testy lying. My lawyer got Ray Crone, the Snaggletooth Killer, off death row.
Right.
He was at a bar. Waitress was dead, who worked at that bar. He was with his mum at home when the crime went down. DNA didn't match. Bite mark on the victim didn't match. State of Arizona paid an expert witness $50,000 to say his teeth matched when they knew it didn't.
Wow. And
they gave him $5,000 to defend himself. And they spent millions and just put on this big theatre show.
Wow.
Yeah. That's how corrupt.
Crazy.
The system is so corrupt.
Crazy.
So what happens?
So yeah, they get the experts.
They get the experts.
By that time, we'd actually located the red E-Type. Well, actually, no, who's got it? It's still around, still driving.
Yeah.
The Mark 10's gone. It's scrapped years ago. But the E-Type, the guy who's got it, I know the guy's got it. I found out his details. He's willing to help. We've given these details to the CCRC and said, look, if you're going to do a 3D scan, which they told us they were going to do, 3D scanning of the vehicles, use the proper car. Get the E-Type and use. No, they didn't. They just brought another E-Type in, which was a different model. So they did this massive 3D scan, and they came back and said, no, we're right, you're wrong. They got one photographic expert who said, no, what it is it's the flash from the camera. But we'd already said, well, it's not the flash from the camera. It's because if you look at the photograph, you can see where the flash ends. You can see. And unbeknownst to we'd found out what the equipment was that the police had used and what the flash bulbs were. And I'd got this guy in America who was telling me all this photographic stuff that was saying, well, look, if they used this flash and this camera, then it would have only reached that far. It wouldn't have reached that far. And so we're adamant that this is enough, but everything comes back as a negative. And I had to make that phone call to Michael Lavaglio and say to him, look, I'm really, really sorry, but we've reached the end of the road with it.
Because you'd made him a promise, hadn't you?
That phone call led to our first face-to-face meeting, and at that meeting, he said, "I want you to go on a search for the truth." And that sounds a bit amdram, doesn't it? But actually, he said, I want you to look at all the evidence, and if at the end of that you think I'm guilty, that's what you've got to say. But if you think I'm innocent, that's what you've got to say. He said, I don't want you to go out to prove that I'm innocent. I want you to go on a search for the truth. And so that is what I did. And I promised him I would do that. And I promised him that I would continue doing that. And so we got to that point, and Michael, I mean, God bless him, I was devastated. I was absolutely devastated. I'd poured years into this, and I wholeheartedly believe now and believed then that Michael was innocent. And I'd done this for him because I just felt he'd been so badly treated. 12 years in high security prison in Wakefield with all these monsters, and it was horrific. And Michael was very level-headed about it all. And he just kind of went, well, that's what I expected, but it's not the end. I was like, well, we need more fresh evidence. He's going, no, not yet. Hang on. So over the coming weeks, we spoke to the lawyers at Kingsley Napley and said, look, is there anything we can do? Michael was all for taking a private prosecution out against the police, and we were advised that probably would have been unsuccessful and cost Michael his house. Michael was still all for doing it, but what we decided to do was to take that decision that the CCRC had made to judicial review. Now that in itself is quite tricky, because what you're saying is you're not saying we think you've made the wrong decision, even though we do think they made the wrong decision. You're not saying that. What you're saying is that we think that the methods that you used to come to that decision were at fault. And so we presented, we put our papers in and said that we felt that they hadn't considered the Tom Fellows evidence in enough detail. What I had found in the National Archives was a police report about Tom Fellows that basically discredited him, as a having this relationship with Vince Lander, which Tom swears to this day he never did. And also, there were 5 or 6 other people on this report that they discredited as well. So, there's a pattern there, obviously. But, we said, look, you haven't considered that. You haven't considered our 3D stuff. And Michael was, again, still very poorly at that time. We got a court date. It was February, I think. And he dragged himself there. Against his doctor's orders. He had a heart complaint, and he had all sorts of things wrong with him, and he dragged himself there, and we went through to the High Court, and we sat and we went through the whole. It was a fascinating process to listen to it all and to be a part of it. I mean, it genuinely was. One of the barristers for the other side, for the CCRC, came across to us before we went in and said, "Are you Michael Lavaglio?" And he said, "Yes." And he said, "I just want to say, I've read a lot about you and your case. Good luck," and shook his hand. This is the guy who was supposed to be, defending the CCRC. So we go in, and very clearly the judge has already made his mind up. There isn't a hearing really to be had. So he's already made his mind up. So unfortunately, we didn't get the result we wanted there either. As we're coming out, before we come out, the judge says, right, well, we need to award costs now. Again, Michael had been warned that he could face up to about £25,000 worth of costs for that 15-minute hearing. And he said, look, we need to award the costs. And the guy from the CCRC stands up and he says, well, I'd like to put in for X amount. I can't remember how much it was now. And this is broken down. Here's my statement of how it's broken down. And all that judge takes it, and the judge looks at it. He looks across at Michael and he looks back down. And he goes, absolutely no way. You two go out, he said, you and Mr. Lavaglio go outside and have a chat. He said, and you come back in when you've decided, but that is not what I'm awarding. And so out we went, and they had a little discussion. And
what was the number, do you know?
It was something like 12 grand he wanted, I think.
Yeah.
It was somewhere around that mark. Which was obviously below what we'd been told, but equally, I mean, he hadn't spent 12 grand's worth of time on it. It was just ridiculous. And so anyway, they agreed on I think Michael paid 300 quid, I think. We offered 300 quid and they said, yeah, done. Let's just get it over and done. They were embarrassed. But we ended up with another no. and so at that point, it kind of seemed as if all the doors were shut. The only way we're going to get it back to the Court of Appeal is fresh evidence. We've exhausted all we can find. So where do we go now? Well, I thought, well, I suppose we go back and start looking at this documentary, don't we? There's a way of highlighting it through that. And so I've got a company called Phantom Line Pictures who are working with me on it. It'll be called Footsteps in the Snow. We've already recorded it all. It's being edited now. We hope to have it out this year, and hopefully that'll highlight it. But the one thing I haven't said is that unfortunately Michael passed away at the end of last year. So Michael never got to see his dream, really, which was to be declared innocent.
That's so sad, man.
It is really, really sad.
The system is uncaring, and they've got all the taxpayer resources in the world just to piss away to prevent justice.
Yeah,
it's absolutely sickening.
He lived his life when he left prison. He lived his life devoted to helping other people. He helped so many hundreds of thousands of people.
Did you say he was in Wakefield prison?
Yeah, he spent a long time in Wakefield. Yeah.
Did he bump into Sykes in there then?
I don't know, to be honest. He never mentioned him. He did slop out and throw a bucket of piss over Ian Huntley. I think he told me.
Did he?
Yeah. Not Ian Huntley. Sorry.
Ian Brady.
Ian Brady. Yeah. Ian Brady. Yeah.
Did he tell you any other prison stories?
Not really. No. I mean, it deeply scarred him.
Yeah.
I mean, what you've got to remember is that this is a guy who's never. I mean, I told you Dennis had some prison time. He knew what the crack was. Michael had never experienced that. And when they went in for remand, when they were on remand, at that time you could have your own food brought in, you could wear your own clothes, you were in a different part of the prison. It was a very different experience, and they did, because they had the means, financial means. They had their own food brought in, from the local hotel, and they genuinely didn't think, either of them thought it was going to go the way it did. They thought it was just a load of old rubbish. And so on the day that they were convicted, Michael is devastated. He meets his brother under the courtroom. His brother says, "Look, sign over all of the company stuff to me. We'll use the money to fight your case." His brother promptly disappears for 10 years and sails around the Med. Michael goes back to prison, now a guilty man, and instead of this slightly cushy little number he'd got where he could have his own food and wear his own clothes, he's strip searched. He's put into a cell with cockroaches it was a horrific first night for Michael, so much so that he tried to take his own life that first night. And it scarred him for a long, long time.
What happened with Dennis then?
In what respect?
Like, is he still alive?
Yeah, Dennis is still alive, yeah. Yeah.
He's not interested in pursuing anything, he's just laying low?
No, I think he is. He still protests his innocence.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I believe him.
And people can get a book on this, Sibbet, A Body Under the Bridge?
Yeah, now, I mentioned right at the beginning this book, Most Unnatural. Well, it kind of came full circle for me last year in that Peter Heumann and David Lewis decided they were going to update the book and re-release it. And because I'd done so much work on the case, they came to me and said, "Look, will you help us? Will you share some of the stuff that you've done?" And by the way, we haven't got a publisher yet. Do you know anybody? Well, as it happens, I do. My best pal Steve Wraith, and he's got a publishing company. So I was able to put the two together, and I helped them with the book. And yeah, at the end of last year, it did come out. Sibbet, A Body Under the Bridge, and it updates the story. It's their book, and then what's happened since. Basically, it's really good.
And when will people be able to watch the documentary?
Well, I'm hoping that we're going to get it finished this year, and it'll be out this year. That's my hope. So, everything's filmed,
so probably later this year.
Yeah. I would think second half of this year.
Yeah. And are you going to tell us about the story of Henry Hill? You spent time with Henry Hill from Goodfellas?
I did. I spent a week with him.
A week?
In my house.
I watched something about him, and he was like foul-mouthed, drunk, out of control.
Henry's lovely.
Is he?
Was no. I mean, look, I've done, if as well as doing, the Sibbet case, I've done a number of documentaries and things like that with Steve, and this was a venture that we kind of went into kind of together, was to bring Henry over, and do a bit of a talking. It was the 21st anniversary of the Goodfellas film, that both of us really liked.
Classic, isn't it?
Oh, it's a brilliant film.
That one I can see now.
Yeah. And I mean, from a filmmaker's point of view, it's brilliant. But from a true crime point of view, it's brilliant too. You know, it's a fantastic film.
Yeah.
And so we both had a wish to kind of bring him over and do a bit of a talking with him. And after quite a long negotiation period of years, I think, he agreed to come with his wife. And there we were in Newcastle Airport. Me with my then 2-year-old son, I think, waiting at arrivals to for Henry and his wife. And he came, and we had shows lined up in various parts of the country. Number of them, I think we had 4 or 5 lined up. One in Newcastle, we had one in London, we had one in Liverpool, one in Blackpool. You know, there were a number of them around the country. And
you said that ominously. Then they were lined up.
Yeah, well, because there lies a story, Shaun. Well, I mean, first of all, in the criminal fraternity, Henry Hill gave evidence against other members of the mob, and you know that is frowned upon, and understandably so. You know, Henry was what's termed as a grass, and a lot of people felt very strongly about that. A lot of people in this country in organised crime felt very unhappy about the fact we were going to bring Henry over. My point of view on that was, look, you know, here's a guy who's lived a life. I don't know the story. I don't know why. Why did he do that? Let's find out. Let's ask him the question. But I certainly had no qualms in bringing him over. And initially, the London lot started to kind of grumble a little bit, and we don't want you to bring him down. We don't want it to happen. It's not good. And you know, the people involved are long dead now. But I still won't name them. But it was, I totally understand their point of view. They didn't want us to bring him in. He was a grass. And then Newcastle lot started. You know, we hear you bringing Henry over. What's the crack? You know, we don't want you to bring grass over. He's not coming here. So then we went, oh, yeah, the London lot don't want us to bring him. What? The London lot don't want you to bring him? Well, don't listen to them. Bring him. You know, so it all kind of changed on its feet. It was weird. But so the Newcastle date went ahead. Everything else mysteriously got cancelled. You know, literally within, you know, there was one venue where we actually had to turn up still to collect some money and then go straight home again. You know, it was just bizarre. It was bizarre. It was a very odd week.
Did the one gig go down well?
Yeah, it was good. I mean, I think I'd love to have seen more people there. I'd love to have done more with him because his story was fascinating. And, you know, it cost us a lot of money to fly him over. And we'd obviously had all of these gigs, you know, didn't look like they were going to go ahead in other places. And we weren't going to make the money that we thought we were going to make to recoup. So he stayed with me. We just couldn't afford to put him in a hotel. So he stayed at my house in the northeast, in a tiny village on the top of a hill. And he was a character. He was a proper character.
Did he behave himself?
He behaved himself, but I mean, look, Henry did like a drink. He did like a drink. I will say that. I don't think that's any secret. He needed a drink to be able to function. So quite a lot of my time was spent avoiding going to the off licence for him. Some of it was spent in the pub over the road playing darts. And we did the pub quiz one night, which was quite funny. And there's a poster behind the Bastard in the Scotch Arms where I live that he signed. He was a real character. I mean, one night we sat up late one night, and you know we'd got the Jack Daniels out, you know, and I said to him, "So why did you tell the tales? To, you know, was it just to get yourself off?" And he said, "Absolutely not. I had a wife, I had 2 kids, and I knew the methods that were employed to get rid of people. And he said, I had it on good authority that my wife and family were going to be put into a freezer, taken out of the freezer again after a little while, put back in again, almost dead, bring them back out again. It would have been torture. And he felt that was the only option open to him. Now, only he knows whether that's the truth, but I have to say, as a father, if I was put in that position, I think I probably know what I would do. And he was put into witness protection, but he got thrown out of witness protection for dealing drugs. So it didn't really do him a great deal of good anyway.
Sammy the Bull set up his ecstasy ring in competition with mine while he was in witness protection.
Yeah. He was a real character, and I'm pleased I got to meet him and spend that time with him, because he was a real character. And there was one really memorable night when I think it was the last night, and I'd been out. I'd had some filming work that day, and I'd left him in the house. And he'd said, "Look, I'll cook your dinner. All the way up. I'm not sure I fancy this, He was going to cook dinner. He said, invite Steve, and invited a couple of well-known faces from Newcastle as well. And he said, come home. He said, and I guarantee you, I'll cook you some dinner. I got home, and first of all, he painted me a massive canvas, like that, which is still in my dining room, which he'd painted the New York skyline on, bless him. But when I walked in, and when Steve walked in, he's there with a razor blade cutting the garlic up, just like he does on the Goodfellas film. And he did these meatballs. They were phenomenal, absolutely phenomenal. And he'd spent all day doing it,
Wow.
And yeah, it was fabulous. And we sat down and we broke bread and we ate food. It was just amazing.
Yeah, he's got a banged up abroad episode out as well. So what other projects are you working on?
Well, we've got, lockdown's given me the opportunity to do a bit more with Steve. So I've helped him with a number of his books, but also we've had a go at kind of putting a few documentaries together that kind of tell a slightly different story. So we've done stuff with Alan Lord.
Oh, out of Manchester, we've had
Manchester,
him on.
yeah,
What a
it's
story.
fascinating and lovely bloke.
When they're trying to capture him and he's running through all the houses.
Yeah,
I'll never forget that story.
And he's such a nice bloke now, and I'm sure he wasn't in his day, but he's such a lovely bloke.
That's the only one that Wellman actually said when we were leaving the studio. He said, he's pretty fucking dangerous.
Oh yeah,
he doesn't think anyone's dangerous.
Yeah, he certainly was in his day. He certainly was. But Alan's story is brilliant, because Alan, as you know, you've had him on. What Alan did changed prison forever. It changed. It gave prisoners more rights. It gave them, just like Michael Avaglio, who we mentioned. We've been talking about Michael. Michael was the first prisoner to gain a degree in prison. He fought for that right. But Alan Lord, a lot of the stuff he was trying to highlight by climbing on the roof, it did make a difference. And so Alan, I found Alan really fascinating. We've done the latest one is Bride of Bronson, which is Charlie Salvador now, but it was Charlie Bronson, his first wife Irene. So they tell their story of what it was like before he became this notorious character, what their life was like, how it was being married. They both tell their story, and that's fascinating one as well. And I think what lockdown's allowed us to do is it's allowed us to visit these kind of characters that Steve and I have talked about between us, because we're both true crime fans. It's allowed us to go and visit these people under COVID rules. I did do a short course on filming under the COVID regulations, so we did everything right. But it's enabled us to go to these people and get these stories that perhaps we may not have had the time to do, normally. And it's been great fun, actually. Albert Sayers is the other one. Albert, who, I've grown very close and very fond of over the years. Albert is the uncle of Stephen Sayers, who I know you've had on here. And Albert is an absolute character, and the history behind Albert and his, he was a rule breaker, but but he forced a change to make street trading legal, in Newcastle and around the country. He made a real difference, and because of his actions, the laws were changed. And Albert's got a fascinating story.
Yeah, check out A Breed Apart if you want to learn that whole history.
Absolutely,
which is the book on Amazon.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It's been great fun, and Brian, I've done Brian Cockrell's little documentary with Brian Cockrell, and that's gone down really well because Brian's a completely changed man now. The Taxman, you've had him on here. He's completely different. He's a lovely.
Did you see him on the Donald McIntyre?
Yes, yeah. I mean, in his day,
picking cars up and everything.
In his day, I mean, the stories Stephen's told me. In his day, Brian was just, you wouldn't have wanted to mess with him at all. But Brian's a changed man, and I've got to know him really well, and he is. It's not just an act. That is Brian.
So if people want to dive deeper into Michael's story, then, which the bulk of this podcast has been about today, you're still running that website?
Yeah, I mean, part of that promise I made Michael was that if anything happened to him, I'd carry on fighting, and I did promise him that, and that is what I will do.
Yeah.
So I will continue doing that, and that part of that means taking on the website and making sure that it's, it's kept up to date and paid for, and and all of that, and so that people can visit that at villainorvictim.com.
We will put that link in the description box. Are there any other links or contact methods that people, you're on all the socials? Or?
I'm on all the socials, Neil Jackson, or Media Art, and I can be contacted on all of those. I mean, I'd say this in every interview I do, whether it's print or what, but that if anybody has any information about the Sibbet case, and I appreciate that we're now 55 odd years on, but if anybody does have any information, please do get in touch, because I did promise Michael that that's what I would do, and I'm determined to do that.
Yeah. So please go down then and check out in the description box the links there for Michael's website if you are interested in the case, and if you want to reach out to Neil, just his socials are down there as well. So huge thank you for coming on then.
Thank you.
And huge thank you to all the people who've watched this. Let us know in the comments what you thought. Subscription logo is in the bottom corner of the screen, and all our socials and donation links are in the description box as well. Well done, man. Yeah, cheers.